Smallpox destroyed the lives of the Native Americans by Regina Ball. This picture is a drawing of a Native American hunting a buffalo before smallpox killed off the elderly Native Americans that were supposed to teach the younger ones how to hunt, which ultimately destroyed the way that they were living their lives before the disease came. Native Americans were not prepared for smallpox. They depended on natural remedies and believed sickness was caused by supernatural forces. This led them to rely on sweat lodges, as shown in the picture, and then dunk the person into icy water to revive him or her. The way they treated smallpox made the disease even worse. The medicine men would chant incantations and unknowingly spread the virus. They would stick a hollow bone in the afflicted's mouth and suck on it. The Europeans did not help the Native Americans until many tribes had already been exterminated. Only then did they decide to vaccinate the tribes. And some of the tribes they did not vaccinate because they regarded them as a threat, such as the Blackfeet Confederation. Native Americans had never encountered smallpox prior to exposure, so as a whole they lacked immunity, unlike the Europeans who had encountered it, their ancestors had encountered it before. Smallpox terminated tribes. There were no cures for smallpox, and there aren't any today. The only way to stop it was by prevention. Vaccinations and inoculations were two ways in which Native Americans were treated. Inoculations would sometimes kill the Native Americans because these consisted of making a small incision and rubbing infected pus into the wound of someone. The victim would get a lesser form of smallpox. Native Americans had extremely weak immune systems, so their safest choice was the vaccination. However, the Europeans often neglected them. Smallpox was extremely contagious and it could not be contained. The rituals of the Native Americans often spread the disease. Tribes would steal from infected tribes, such as horses and blankets and other items, and then they would become sick. This was a continuous pattern. Now, this graph depicts how detrimental smallpox was to the Native American population in the 1800s. As you can see, more than half of their population was wiped out by smallpox compared to conflicts with the whites, beaver wars, and genocide. Smallpox stole the independence of the Native Americans. It made the remaining Native American tribes completely dependent on the fur trade with the Americans, because before they were able to hunt and fish and create crafts. But since smallpox wiped out a lot of the elder Native Americans, there was no one to teach the younger ones how to survive that way. So in order for them to eat and live, they had to depend on the fur trade. So many tribes had to create this picture, which is a buffalo robe, and they would create them in mass production just to survive. Many tribes, especially the Mandan, the Arikara, and the Hidatsa, had to merge in order to survive. They used to each be powerful by themselves, but smallpox destroyed their members and even wiped out the Mandan chief forebear, and they had to work together in order to live. It also wiped out entire tribes, such as the Blackfeet Confederation. They were a feared tribe, and smallpox reduced them so badly that they had to cower in fear from other tribes and from the whites. Conclusion. Smallpox had a negatively profound effect on the Native Americans in the United States. They were not prepared for the disease. It decimated entire tribes, and it stole their independence from them, and much of their culture. They were no longer able to live the way that they had originally. Now, in this picture, this is Chief Forebears of the Mandan. He was a friend of the Europeans until smallpox ravaged his body and finally killed him. And I have a speech that he gave to the Mandan, and this is what he said. My friends, one and all, listen to what I have to say. Ever since I can remember, I have loved the whites. I have lived with them ever since I was a boy, and the best of my knowledge, I have never wronged a white man. On the contrary, I have always protected them from the insults of others, which they cannot deny. The forebears never saw a white man hungry, but what he gave him to eat, drink, and a buffalo skin to sleep on, in time of need. I was always ready to die for them, which they cannot deny. I have done everything that a redskin could do for them. And how have they repaid it? With ingratitude. I have never called a white man a dog, but today I do pronounce them to be a set of black-hearted dogs. They have deceived me. Them that I always considered as brothers has turned out to be my worst enemies. I have been in many battles and often wounded, but the wounds of my enemies I exult in. But today I am wounded, and by whom? By those same white dogs that I have always considered and treated as brothers. I do not fear death, my friends. You know it. But to die with my face rotten, that even the wolves will shrink with horror at seeing me, and say to themselves, that is the forebears, the friend of the whites. Listen well what I have to say, as it will be the last time you will hear me. Think of your wives, children, brothers, sisters, friends, and in fact all that you hold dear. All are dead, or dying, with their faces all rotten, caused by those dogs, the whites. Think of all that my friends, and rise all together and not leave one of them alive. The forebears will act his part. Now, that was a quote by Forebears, and he generally went crazy from the disease. He hid in the mountains until it was time for him to die, but you can see that it had a very horrible effect on all of the Native Americans. Here's a list of my suggested readings. Robertson, R.G., Rotting Face. This book is very informative as to how smallpox damaged the lives of the Native Americans on every aspect, such as their trading system and their population, and it really gives a good description of what happened to each tribe. Many tribes were affected by smallpox, not just the Mandan, the Arikara, the Hidatsa, the Blackfeet Confederation. Those are only a few. And this book goes into detail about a lot of the tribes that had been affected and destroyed by this disease. The next source is Chardon's journal at Fort Clark. This is a primary source, and it's written by a trading post commander who kept a journal, and it discusses how smallpox ruined the Mandan tribe in specifics, but it also discusses the other tribes that were destroyed. And it's a very good source and a very good reading, because when you read it, you can see that the trading post commander, Chardon, he didn't really care about the Mandans, but near the end, he expressed kind of regret for the tribes. This next source is by Melissa Haverson, and it's a journal article. And she basically is telling us about the treatments that the Native Americans would use. And this is very important to understand when you think about the Native Americans and smallpox, because the way that they treated the disease had a huge role in destroying their tribes. They would spread the disease unknowingly, and it would make it even worse. For example, the sweat lodges, those people would be crammed in sweat lodges, and so they would be breathing on each other and everything. It's very important that we understand this, because you can see why their methods of treatment failed and why it only got worse for them. Overall, I think this presentation was very interesting, and this project was very eye-opening. It really made me see that the Native Americans suffered a very great deal at the hands of smallpox. And at one point, they even wanted to kill the whites for bringing smallpox to them. but they couldn't because they were wiped out almost completely.